Hello, my name is Oliver Marquardt from Weierstrass Institute Berlin, and today I'll be talking about wave function engineering in indium gallium arsenide, indium aluminum arsenide core shell nanowires. And the present study has been done in collaboration with Lutz Gehlhaar and Oliver Brandt from Paul-Drude Institute Berlin. Indium gallium arsenide is a relevant material system for emission and absorption within the telecommunications Z-band at 1.55 microns. And employing the material system of indium gallium arsenide and indium aluminum arsenide in combination within core shell nanowires facilitates the tunability of several aspects. We can control quantum confinement within the core region of the system within the indium gallium arsenide core. We can control the elastic properties by adjusting the composition of the indium aluminum arsenide shell and the thickness of the shell. And finally, we are even able to control the order of the wavelength bands and therefore to control the composition of whole wave functions. And that means in the end what we are able to do is in fact something like wave function engineering. So what I'll be talking about in particular is a model system with an indium gallium arsenide core with an indium content of 0.53 and the gallium content of 0.47 of the diameter d, and surrounded by a 50 nanometer thick indium aluminum arsenide shell with an indium content x that will be taken as a free parameter here. And what we do in the following is we compute the strain distribution and built-in electrostatic potentials from continuum elasticity theory and by solving the Poisson equation. And in the next step we compute the electronic properties of the system using an 8-band K.P model, which has been particularly adjusted for 1-1-1 oriented zinc blende crystals, which is typically what applies to such nanowires. The formalisms were implemented within a plane wave framework in the Sphinx software library, and the relevant input parameters are taken from Wohlgeftmann's work. Now that's the workflow of a typical simulation within our code. So we basically start setting up a 3D material map that contains all information on the geometry and the composition of the system. We add all the material parameters like lattice and elastic constants, but also piezoelectric constants, and in the next step we compute the elastic properties of the system using continuum elasticity theory, and from once we know the strain we can switch on a Poisson solver and compute the built-in electrostatic potentials, in this case the polarization potentials. In the next step, we employ an eigenvalue solver using multiband, in this particular case an 8-band K.P Hamiltonian, which takes more material parameters like effective masses and band offsets, band couplings and so on into account. And finally, we basically be able to do a self-consistency loop, but here for the system that does not play too much of a role, so we have not used this. All this has been done within the Sphinx library, and the Sphinx library is now available to everybody using simple packet manager installation processes at our Sphinx repository website, and also there are tutorials available that are also linked to the Newsot site. Okay, these are the elastic properties of the system. What you see down here are essentially the strain distributions for the diagonal epsilon xx, yy, zz, and the off-diagonal parts epsilon xy, xz, and yz. This is for an example system where the indium content of the outer indium aluminum arsenide shell is 60% and the core diameter is 30 nanometers. You can see the core region marked in red here. Basically, we see that we can control the strain between approximately plus minus 2% for the diagonal strain components via the core diameter and the indium content of the shell, which here for this study has been tuned between 25 and 80%. And also we find that we can address both the tensor and the compressive strain regimes by modifying the indium content of the outer indium aluminum shell. So that said, we can control all that by experimentally well accessible parameters. That's pretty much what a corresponding built-in electrostatic potential, the polarization potential, looks like. And depending on the material composition of the outer shell and the thickness of the core, we can have polarization potentials of up to plus minus 50 millivolts here. So that can be significant, as we will also see in the next slides. What we see in this slide is the behavior of the bent edges of the core region of our indium gallium arsenide, indium aluminum arsenide core shell nanowire as a function of the indium content X of the indium aluminum arsenide shell. And first of all, so this is the conduction band, the black one here. Blue and red are the light hole and heavy hole band, and down here that's the spin orbit split off band. We can address the compressive and the tensile regime here by varying the indium content of the indium aluminum arsenide shell, and these points here correspond to a lattice matched reference system. So to say a system with 52% indium content in the indium aluminum arsenide shell, which is perfectly lattice matched to the indium gallium arsenide core region with an indium content of 53%. So the first observation we have is that with increasing indium content, the conduction band decreases in energy. The heavy hole and light hole bands, first of all, the light hole band decreases, the heavy hole band increases, so overall the band gap will be reduced for higher indium content. And what is even more interesting to see is that in fact we have a crossing of the light hole and heavy hole bands here. That said, we can, with this strain, we can in fact decide which of the two bands will dominate the character of the whole state. So this slide shows the transition energies between the electron and hole ground state for different core diameters as a function of the indium content of the aluminum arsenide shell. This is again the reference system, and what we see first is that of course all these transition energies decrease, which isn't too surprising because essentially, well, the band gap decreases as we have seen in the last slide. This becomes stronger here, where basically the heavy hole character of the hole takes over, and nevertheless we have a handful of systems here in this 1.55 microns regions that we are interested in. But what is more interesting is to have a look at the electron-hole ground state overlap. So this is shown here again for core diameters of 10, 20 and 30 nanometers as a function of the indium content of the indium aluminum arsenide shell. And this electron-hole geometrical ground state overlap in fact shows some interesting features. First of all, it increases to a certain extent, then it breaks down, increases again, and is reduced then to, in the end, an extremely small value. And now let's try to understand what we see here. So the first thing that happens is that with a higher indium content of the indium aluminum arsenide shell, confinement of inside the shell increases, which leads to a better confinement of the hole state and basically increases the electron-hole overlap. The character of the hole state is here mostly dominated by the light hole band. This happens only up to a certain point, and at this point an intermediate region takes over where essentially the whole state is dominated by both the light and the heavy hole band. So this is really strong band mixing that occurs here. The shape of the whole state looks like this, and it is clear that while the electron has always for all these systems an S-like behavior and will sit in the middle of the core shell wire of the core, the hole exhibits such a ring-like shape here, and that's it. Of course the overlap will be reduced, and at a certain point the heavy hole band starts to dominate. So this increases the overlap between electron and the hole again. Hole state now looks something like this, and then it decreases here slightly first because now we are in a region where the built-in electrostatic potentials start to become more dominant, and all of a sudden up here for very high indium contents the electrostatic potentials become so strong that they essentially pull the hole states out of the core, which leads then to a severe reduction of the overlap here. If we look at the character of the electrons and holes, so what you see here is the contribution that each band has to the wave function of a certain state. So this is for the electrons. We see that the electrons are unsurprisingly dominated for all diameters, mostly by the S-like conduction band, whereas the PX, PY-like valence bands play a minor role, and the PZ-like band, which is associated to the light hole, essentially plays no role at all for the composition of the electrons. The situation is entirely different for the hole states. Here, apparently the S-like band plays no role, but we see that depending on the diameter of the core, but as a general feature with higher indium content, there comes the point where the light hole, the PZ-like band, is essentially replaced by the PX-PY-like bands up here. So this is essentially what happens for all these diameters, just at different indium contents of the outer shell. Again, these are the reference system values, and there is such an intermediate region here where in fact the contributions of PX and PY and PZ-like states are about the same, so this is this intermediate region where essentially the whole state sees quite strong band mixing between light hole and heavy hole band. So let me summarize our work in progress. So what we were interested in is to explore the capabilities of indium gallium arsenide, indium aluminum arsenide core shell nanowires for wave function engineering. In particular, we have taken an indium gallium arsenide core with 53% indium content and strained this via an indium aluminum arsenide shell of indium content X. We have seen that we can in fact control the elastic properties of the system by adjusting the core diameter D and the shell indium content X, and with this we can modify the contribution of light and heavy hole band to the hole state by strain, which allows us finally to control the whole wave function composition, localization, electron-hole transition energies, and overlaps by parameters that are experimentally well accessible. Summarizingly, this means that in fact we are able to use our setup to perform wave function engineering in a realistic manner as could be done in experiment directly. What we will try to do in the near future is to see if we can also compute the gain spectra of such systems, but that's work in progress and not yet shown in this presentation. And finally, let me acknowledge funding by the DFG within the MAT Plus Mathematics Research Center, and of course I thank you for your attention.